And so remember, if we're talking about a community, we are again in a particular habitat, a particular location. In a given ecosystem, however, we could have thousands to millions of little habitats, things that, you know, we think a habitat is more than just saying forest. A habitat is a particular, you know, in a given red oak tree, you know, that there could be a hole for certain organisms to live, or underneath the leaflet or near the tree could be microhabitats, in the soil, under the roots, up in the canopy, on the edges, behind the bark. There are all these little microhabitats in a big ecosystem. And so by maintaining diversity of organisms, we maintain diversity of microhabitats, and we keep a system complex. Now the next word is a little bit advanced. It's pronounced ecological niche. In the Midwest, we say niche sometimes, but technically it's niche. And if you've heard this word before, you probably learned it as the job a species has. It's a little more advanced than that. But to understand the role it plays in the community, you have to understand or recognize that this individual adapted alongside everything else in that community or in that habitat. And so the role it plays is a lot more than what it's doing day to day. The role it plays, its niche, also involves, you know, how it's interacting with that environment, how it's consuming the nutrients, what is it leaving behind, you know, how does it eat, where does it eat, where does it live, how does it reproduce, when does it reproduce. All of those things about that organism play a role in it functionally existing in a niche, a spot in that ecosystem. And that's the job that we have. We said that nature doesn't read textbooks, it does what it wants. And so we go in trying to understand these things, especially now when we're losing organisms daily. Things are going extinct. If we understand what niche we're losing, we can try to maintain these habitats before they are gone completely. And so an ecological niche includes habitat and interaction with other organisms. Now there are, if you go into advanced ecology, there are different terms you'll learn, like fundamental and realized niche. And so there's a role it can play to survive, and then a role it plays when it is thriving. But it's just consider it that it is its spot. If you think of an ecosystem like a chain, everything chained together, a niche is a link in that chain. And so if certain things go extinct or removed, or that link is weakened, the whole chain is weak. And so a niche, ecological niche, and the complexity of those sort of maintain the health and the balance of that community. Now, when we're in a given community, things aren't living in a vacuum. They are eating, sleeping, drinking, breathing, all the things they're doing alongside other organisms. And so that means competition begins to occur. Competition fuels diversity. Competition occurs when members of different species try to utilize the same resource. So food, energy, habitat, mates, etc. And so when two species compete, the abundance of both species is negatively impacted because that's less resource. And whether resource means mate or shelter or food or water or air, it could be any of that, but it's less of that resource. Does any, well, of the three of you that are in here, because I can't, who knows what Zoom is doing? I'm probably not even there. Do you like dessert? Do you like pie? What's your favorite pie? Chocolate pie? That's a good one. I like pumpkin pie. What's a pie that nobody likes? Like, how do you feel about that gross store-bought jelly cherry pie? Sure. Can you picture it? Not the best, right? If you were to have picture your favorite pie, like your homemade, delicious, wonderful, tasty pie, and then like the weird cherry, gelatinous, kind of gross, it's been sitting out for a couple of weeks pie. And that's all we had to eat, all of us, even those on Zoom, right? We're all going after the same delicious, tasty piece. If we're trying to be fair, obviously the share of that pie becomes smaller and smaller and smaller the more of us there are. So we're competing for that resource. That's less of us to have that resource. But what if one day I decide, while all of you are fighting over that delicious, wonderful homemade pie that you love, that I'll go and I'll try the kind of gross, older, gelatinous, not quite delicious frozen cherry pie. And I tend to like it. That's all of that resource for me now, while all of you are fighting over the other. Competition. We were talking about chapter 15, evolution and adaptation, natural selection. Competition and mutation are the biggest fuels for adaptation. Because now if I have that resource, now I'm going to go after that resource. And if I am behaviorally inclined to prefer that resource, I am always going to have more than you have. I'm always going to have more energy, more access, which means I'm going to be able to survive better, hang out better, compete better, have more offspring. My reproductive fitness is going to increase. Now, what if I decide that I want to be a generalist and I want to eat both of those pies? Well, then my energy resource, my energy consumption goes up even more. And so that type of specialization or that type of generalization reduces competition and fuels diversity. And so there used to be an experiment we did, we don't do it anymore, where we would grow 2 types of paramecium on a plate in lab, and we would look at it. Now, obviously they do well enough on their own instead of a particular Petri dish, but if we were to put them both on the same exact Petri dish, one of those organisms isn't going to do as well as the other because there's no space. Oftentimes, space is one of the biggest limiting factors. Space is what limits things from taking hold. And that's true for large organisms and small organisms. That's true, if you think about the bacteria that are living inside of you right now, we say that they're beneficial bacteria helping you out, they're a part of you. It's not that they are going in and they are attacking other bad bacteria. Oftentimes they're just taking up free real estate. And so there's no room for bad bacteria to grow. And so space can be a big limiting factor. So don't forget that. Now here's where we kind of have to expand our brains for a second. And so we go from general biology to probably a little bit more advanced concepts. So don't let me lose you. But if we're talking about an individual, talking about organisms, thinking about competition, and thinking about a realized niche in a given ecosystem, no 2 species can occupy the same niche at the same time. And through what we have observed, this is true in every ecosystem. If you understand the fundamental and realized niche of that organism, this is true for every ecosystem we've seen. It occurs over and over and over. It's one of the biggest principles of ecology, that no 2 organisms can definitely occupy the same niche at the same time. It's called the Competitive Exclusion Principle. Because if 2 things occupied the same niche at the same time, there would not be enough resources to support either of those populations. So instead, we see adaptations or changes that allow those organisms to occupy separate roles, separate niche spots in that ecosystem, which is called resource partitioning. And it's why we see so many different species. It's why we see such diversity when there are areas of high competition, when there are areas of high resources, which is kind of here. We usually teach here for this class, and that's kind of here. So I need you to think about that for a second and understand it. But it begins to explain a lot. It begins to lay the foundation for a lot of things, and it's one of the biggest sort of foundations for tons of biological concepts, including evolution and the cell theory. Resource partitioning leads to niche specialization and less niche overlap between species. So things are always going to do better when they don't occupy that same role. Trying to access the same resource tends to lead to a distinct specialization, so me going after that gross cherry pie, or a generalization. So if you think about insects, when flowering plants evolved, insects begin to specialize alongside certain organisms. So insects are some of the most specialized things that we have on the planet, where they're often closely tied to one particular type of plant, or one particular color, or one particular habitat type. Which was great, but what happens if your food, what happens if the cherry pie runs out? If your food source is gone, you're gonna go extinct too. So another survival mechanism, another adaptation was generalization. That's when I said me going after the cherry pie and the delicious homemade pie. If I'll eat whatever, I can also benefit. And there's no rule to what is better, it just depends on what is better for that organism. Because remember, you're limited by what you are. You're limited by your genome. And so this slide pulls in a lot of information for several different things, and I definitely have a couple questions about it on the exam, but I need you to maybe think about it for a second. And so with this resource partitioning, we see character displacement, which means different traits. And so characteristics become more divergent when populations belong to the same community than when they are isolated, which, hold on, that's a major, major difference than what we talked about in the 1800s. Because when we were talking about natural selection and speciation, and we're looking at these fossils and we're beginning to understand these ecosystems, we always said things must be different when they're separated for enough time. Either across a valley, on the other side of a mountain, across oceans, right? Given enough time, things become different. Great, that makes sense in our brains. Really, where we see the most difference occur is in the same ecosystems where there is no separation, because that's where we have the most competition. And so it's more beneficial to have a different trait than it is to have the same trait, because you're going after a different resource. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of this heady abstract concept, especially if you didn't pay attention last chapter. But this was a big thing. And so that's why the competition exclusion principle really kind of helped expand all of these concepts. And so we're going to see a little bit, not much, but how when you have resource partitioning, you have lowered competition. And so we begin to see different traits in the same ecosystems. And sometimes it explains those large jumps that we see in the fossil record because there was so much competition. It explains why we see so much diversity in the rainforest areas where there is so much energy and so much abundance. You have to find ways to reduce competition or your species won't survive, which again, that's teleological. I say they have to find a way. It's not like these things got together and says, all right, we're gonna go look like that and go after the cherry pie because that makes us better. Remember, it doesn't work that way. It just sort of happens. I shouldn't have said they have to find a way, like they're choosing to do so. It's just sort of a natural phenomenon. And so let's stop there. And so next time I'll move into niche specialization and microhabitats, and then we'll finish up this chapter. So if you have any questions, let me know. Please take a look at this. Don't let it get away from you because there are a lot of chapters this unit. What's the homework? What should you be working on right now? Tree of Life, Darwin and the Tree of Life, and the How Evolution Works worksheet from lab. So give me those two things sometime if you haven't already, and I'll put those grades in. Otherwise, I'll see you Monday. Yep, video.